He was a professor of history and government in a number of colleges. He then went on to be president of Princeton University, where one of our guests today is still a lecturer. And then he became governor of New Jersey for 2 years, and in 1912 ran for president and served 2 terms as president of the United States. But Wilson was a great believer in bringing together the 2 worlds that he inhabited, the world of scholarship and the world of policymaking. And he felt that if you brought together the thinkers and the doers, that both would benefit from an exchange of ideas on issues of the day. And that's the spirit in which Congress decided on a living memorial rather than one more marble monument to a former president. And we conduct about 800 meetings a year in these rooms, and this is just one of those 800, so welcome. Ordinarily, the Congress Project programs bring together a couple of members of Congress from each party and a journalist and a scholar to talk about a particular policy issue and how that issue plays out both from the political and the process standpoint on Capitol Hill. Today's is a little bit of a departure, and as you may suspect by now, it's for a particular reason on this day. We usually do ours on Monday, but today is September 17th, Constitution Day. It was 223 years ago today that the founders at the convention in Philadelphia finally approved the document that would be sent on to the state conventions for ratification. But I thought it would be a good program to put on now, especially since there are a lot of questions being raised about the viability of our system today. Back in February or March, I believe it was, Joe Biden, the vice president, was being interviewed by CBS News, and he was asked whether he thought Washington was broken. And he said, yes, I think Washington is broken. And then they said, well, what about your stimulus program that you're directing? He said, well, that's not broken. That's running quite fine, thank you. But otherwise, Washington is broken. Well, Rasmussen polling organization ran a poll shortly thereafter. Do you agree with Vice President Biden that Washington is broken? And overall, I think it was about 83% of the people said yes, it was broken. 87% of mainstream voters agreed it was broken. But 73% of the political class, those that work in and around government, disagreed and did not think it was broken. So I guess it depends on where you sit and how you view the operation of our government that might determine your answer to that question. I won't take a poll of our current audience, but I know that we have a good mix of people that work in and around government as well as some that are just curious and are here to find out a little bit more about how things really work. But we are very pleased to have a group of distinguished folks to help us with this particular debating topic, if you want to call it that. And you all have their biographies in your handouts. It's also available on our website. And incidentally, this program is being webcast live. So I would ask you if you have any electronic devices, whether they're Blackberries or cell phones or electric shavers, to turn them off because they will interfere with our audio system and our transmission. So please turn those off at this time if you would. But what we're going to do is we're going to start with Kevin O'Leary, who works on the West Coast. He's with writes for Time Magazine and Time.com, and he's with the Research Institute out there in California as a research fellow. And he has written a book, by the way, that will be available for you to buy afterwards if you're interested, called Saving Democracy, a Plan for Real Representation in America. But he's going to take the affirmative of this, that Washington or our constitutional system is broken, or at least argue for what he would consider a fairer and more accountable and responsive system of representation. He will be followed by Bill Connelly, who is down at Washington and Lee University. Bill just wrote a book entitled James Madison Rules America, The Constitutional Origins of Congressional Partisanship. I have a blurb on the back, which I will not read because I don't have my reading glasses on, but it's highly favorable. I'll have to, in interest of full disclosure, let you know. Maybe Bill will read it later. But Bill is going to take the position that at least the political class and that the Rasmussen poll take, that things are really working as intended. As much as you might get frustrated with them, as much as you see a lot of obstruction and delay and partisanship, that's really what was intended. So he's going to argue that case. Then we're going to go to Greg Koger, who's down at the University of Miami, whose president is Donna Shalala, I might mention, and she's participated in a couple of programs here, both when she was Secretary of HHS and then since she's been at the University of Miami. But Greg is author of another book, which we do not have for sale today, but certainly is available on Amazon.com, and it was just out this year, I believe. It's called Filibustering, A Political History of Obstruction in the House and the Senate. And I just attended the American Political Science Association conference a couple of weeks ago, and this was very highly mentioned and favorably regarded by a number of the panelists that I heard at that convention, so I would recommend that. Finally, we're going to have as our cleanup hitter, Mickey Edwards, who is a long-term, 16-year, I believe, congressman from Oklahoma, Republican congressman. He was part of the Republican leadership when he was on the Hill. He since went on to, I believe, the Kennedy School at Harvard, and now is at the Aspen Institute as one of their vice presidents, and he runs some interesting fellowship programs with elected leaders from around the country and taking them on trips and getting to know each other and talk about various things. But he is also, as I mentioned earlier, a lecturer at the alma mater of Woodrow Wilson, which Wilson also ruled over as president for a few years. And Wilson once remarked, and I'm sure you've used this a number of times, that there's nothing like the politics of the universities or academia. He says, when you get into the politics of being governor or president, he says that's pretty mild compared to some of the politics that he encountered there as president of Princeton with the board of trustees and the alumni and so on, and the faculty members, I guess I should add. But with that, I will turn things over to Kevin O'Leary. The panelists are allowed to either present from where they are or use the podium. Our webcam will catch you wherever you wander in this room, so please present from wherever you'd like.
All right, I'll go from here. This is fine. In terms of thinking about the government that is not broken, Bill is obviously closer to the government both physically and philosophically. So my talk's about two flaws at the center of the Constitution, and one in particular. And I'll start off by saying, Americans are rightly proud of the Constitution, a structure of government that's endured while the nation has grown from 3 million people in 13 states to 300 million plus with 50 states across North America. But while most Americans deeply admire the Constitution, it's nevertheless deeply flawed when judged against modern democratic standards. And that's where I'm coming from in this paper, because you have to pick a criteria. How would you judge the Constitution? That's the criteria I'm going to use. And that's true in regards to presidential elections and the Electoral College, as our experience in 2000 showed. But it's also true with respect to the Senate and the House of Representatives. For by calling for representation of states instead of people, the Senate is a profound violation of one man or one woman and one vote, or political equality, one of the most fundamental principles of democracy. Now, the House, on the other hand, meets the requirement of vote equality, but today's districts are disturbing in the sense that originally they were 1 to 30,000, now they're 1 to 700,000, and someday they'll be 1 to 1 million. It's hard to think of this being what Madison wanted when he was writing in the Federalist Papers, that the House of Representatives should have a, quote, intimate connection with the people. Now, both problems stem from the framers living at a time when modern democracy was at its infancy. They were the vanguard of the first modern democratic revolution. Now, they knew they wanted to break away from monarchy and aristocracy, but they were fearful of mass democracy. Not everybody, but a number of the framers were. And they fashioned a political system that keeps the public at arm's length. I mean, look at the presidency with the Electoral College. The Senate was voted from the state legislatures. So only the House was from the people. And then you have the Supreme Court eventually getting judicial review, another branch of the government that has no direct connection to the people. So it keeps the public at arm's length. It makes a mockery of majority rule, as I hope I'll explain. And it provides multiple opportunities for the most privileged minorities to protect their interests. So I'll discuss in turn democracy and the Constitution, the Senate's violation of political equality, and the norms of our unwritten Constitution before turning to a suggested reform. Democracy and the Constitution. Robert Dahl begins his really fine recent book at the start of this decade, and it's titled How Democratic is the American Constitution, with 3 questions. He says, first, why should we feel bound today by a document that was produced more than 2 centuries ago by a group of 55 men, actually signed by only 39, a number of whom were slaveholders adopted by 13 states? And the thing that struck me in reading this, was by the votes of fewer than 2,000 men when it was ratified. Second, have we Americans ever had an opportunity to express our considered will about our constitutional system? And third, how well does our constitutional system meet democratic standards of today? What's the purpose of a constitution? Dahl, the leading political scientist and democratic thinker of his generation, R. Madison, if you will, suggests this answer. The only legitimate constitution for a democratic people is one crafted to serve democratic ends. From this perspective, an American constitution ought to be the best that we can design for enabling politically equal citizens to govern themselves under laws and policies that have been adopted or maintained by their rational consent. So we should think of the Constitution as a means to an end. It is one tool by which we move to the goal of popular sovereignty. And, you know, when you walk in this building, there's one spot where you have the Berlin Wall, and you think back to when Václav Havel came and addressed both houses of Congress in a joint session, and he said, interestingly, he said, democracy is an ideal. You approach it as you want a horizon that can never be fully attained. And in this sense, you too, Americans, are also merely approaching democracy. So in a sense, what I want to get at is that even though during the Cold War it was often the case where we wanted to be a paragon of democracy, and in terms of foreign policy and our own sense of democracy, we adopted a sense that if we had the basics, the kind of the bare bones basics of democracy, which have never been questioned in the U.S., of, you know, free and fair elections, a free press, things that in a lot of countries are very, you know, circumspect and not achieved. But we've always had the principles of what in political science is called polyarchy. And you have a minimum, you always have a situation of competitive elites, as Joseph Schumpeter, the famous economist at Harvard, wrote when he kind of crafted this paradigm view of modern democracy, which has been adopted by many political scientists and drifted down into the public's knowledge. But there's also a tradition in American politics of going beyond that. And so kind of the background of my paper is around that. Thinkers like John Dewey and a lot of the progressives who have over time pushed our sense of what democracy means as something we are trying to attain gradually, right? And one of the main things with this is you think of popular sovereignty as this radical idea at the turn of when the American Revolution happened, that both the framers and Rousseau were willing to confront all the traditional thinking and all the great philosophers before and say, no, sovereignty comes from the people. Madison went beyond anybody else at the time and said, no, you can go beyond a city-state. You can have a republic that is a nation-state that is big, and this Constitution is going to show how that can be done. I mean, that was really tremendous revolutionary idea. So in a lot of ways, the founders were obviously great thinkers and did a lot. But what I'm trying to point out here is that when they crafted the idea of the Senate in particular, because of the Connecticut Compromise and basing that on states, not on people, that's a radical problem within the Constitution itself, which, you know, we know it would be so impossible to change that we don't really look at it very much, right? It's just kind of there. But it has profound consequences, both historically and today and ongoing. So it is something maybe we should think about it once in a while. What can we do about it if we could? So what I'm saying is kind of in particular, the Senate part of the Constitution is our original sin. It's had a profound effect on our history, and it remains embedded in the Constitution. Now, why is political equality important? Because I'm kind of basing it on that. And I was referencing about the idea of inclusion. Well, we want to include everybody in the polity. Well, obviously, when the framers wrote it, it took slaves out, 3/5 of a vote. So you have women, African Americans, a lot of minorities, and what we achieved from the Civil War on is tremendous in the sense of inclusion. I mean, the 20th century can be looked at in terms of democracy as an age of including people, so people have full citizenship, right? So we're almost there. We've got the debate in California and other places about gay rights, but it's closing in terms of that. So that's been a big fight. But if you go beyond that and you look at the Senate and you say, because of this situation in the Senate of having 2 votes for every state, no matter how small, that we have allowed strategically placed, and I'm quoting Dahl, strategic placed and highly privileged minorities have been able to use the Senate to gain disproportionate power over government decision-making. And it's interesting to know, you know, we always talk about the Constitution protecting minority rights. Well, whose minority rights, right? Which minorities? And often underprivileged minorities have not fared that well. It's telling, for example, that between 1800 and 1860, that there were 8 anti-slavery measures passing the House, but they all were killed in the Senate. Now, at the time of the Constitution, not everybody agreed on the Connecticut Compromise, and two of the most important people who didn't were two of the most important and brilliant intellectuals that were among the 55, James Madison and James Wilson, who bitterly opposed what seemed to them to be an arbitrary, unnecessary, and unjustifiable limit on national majorities. Wilson remarked, "Can we forget for whom we're forming a government? Is it for men or for imaginary beings called states?" And the constitutional expert Sanford Levinson, who teaches at the University of Texas, recently wrote a book about this problem in the Constitution and how to fix it. And he, quote him, he says, "The equal vote rule in the Senate makes an absolute shambles of the idea that in the United States the majority of the people rule." And you just have to kind of, once in a while shake yourself. And why on the earth should Alaska, Delaware, we're all talking about Delaware right now, right, this week? Delaware, Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Vermont, and Wyoming. 7 states, they all have 1 representative. So Mike Castle's 1 representative. He's going to move up in the world to become one of 2 senators, right? But his Senate vote's not going to have that much weight, or is going to have a tremendous amount of weight, right? So that's the thing. But if you look, it kind of gets to you if you say, okay, those 7 states, they have 5.2 million people by the last census. Well, the state of Minnesota also has 5.2 million people. They only get 2 senators. Why should these states have 14, right? So what I'm basically saying is the Constitution why should we treat people who live in small states as if they're far more important than the rest of us? Majority rule, why is it important? Because it's real simple. It's the fairest decision-making rule. It's hard, you can't come up with a decision rule that goes away from majority rule that you don't have a big argument about. So with majority rule, you're giving as many people as possible, allowing the greatest number of people to live under the laws they have chosen. Any move away from majority rule sanctions minority rule. That's what you have to understand. The larger the supermajority, the smaller the minority that is sufficient to veto and impose its will on the majority. When is that fair? So you think about, I'm from California, I've covered the state budget crisis for a decade. If you look at that, it's based in part on a recalcitrant Republican minority and the requirement that both tax increases and a budget, it's the only state in the union that allows this, budget and tax increases have to be by 2/3 vote. So it gives, because of, right, everybody knows about redistricting and what's going to happen with the next time we do district lines, and you're talking about that in your paper, Mickey, that you've got protected groups. It's all Republican district or all Democratic. So the Republicans have a set group of people in California, and they're not going to lose that. So they have enough votes to basically have incredible leverage on a Republican governor and the Democrats in the majority in both houses. Right? And Paul Krugman and others have talked about that kind of California dysfunction moving to the Capitol. Now, my colleague here will disagree and say that, no, we're not having this, we've always had that. But that's one way to look at it. Now, policy implications, I'm kind of talking about that already. But Dahl writes in his magnum opus, Democracy and Critics, in 1989, he says, by their very nature, supermajority requirements privilege the status quo and preserve existing injustices against reforms favored by the majority. So you might look at the healthcare battle this year. Yes, it took a long time. Why? Well, if you look at the paper that I left out front, just the little LA Times op-ed, it's interesting to look when Pew and other pollsters look at people's frustration with politics, but their understanding on the other hand, they don't know what the filibuster does. They don't understand that a minority, distinct minority in the Senate can block everything. They just think Congress doesn't work. Right? In the paper, I have a nice little quote, but I'll let you look at that, from Thomas Gahagian about the Senate. And what's interesting about that quote, it's kind of halfway through the paper, is he's talking about Jimmy Carter time. And it's the same frustration progressives have today. He can't figure out, like, why do things come out of the House and nothing comes out of the Senate? Now, he's talking about a time when the Democrats weren't able to push things through, but it's the same frustration that the progressives have now. So let me speed ahead, in the sense that I just want to point out in the middle of this paper is that the small state bias that we have now, if you take the Republican minority, and it could be a different time, the Democratic minority having 41 votes, right? What's interesting to do is calculate in your head is, where do those senators come from? And under the Republican minority that exists right now, they only have control of 3 large states, and not total control. They only have Texas as one really large state with 24 million people. They have 2 senators there. That's the only place where they have 2 senators. That's a lot of people. They have 1 senator in Florida, so they split that, and they have 1 senator in Ohio. The rest of their states are very small or fairly small, 37 states. If you total up that population, if you look on my paper, page 7 and 8, what I've done is I've taken the state population, but then I've weighted it in the far left, far right column to signal whether the Republicans have 2 senators or 1, and then added up that population. So I've doubled the population from 300 million to 600 million, and then looked at the total for the Republican population for the states. When you do that calculation, you end up with 30, what have I got? 30, just under 37%, 36.8%. That's the population they're representing, actually. If you remove those 4 senators that are from big states, they only have 30%. So it's not like they have 41% that are blocking things. But usually, because of the way Senate rules work, it's very difficult to move things through because of unanimous consent and because of filibuster. And at the end of that chart, I just kind of use a news story from the Wall Street Journal. It's a very flat narrative. It's just kind of, this is the normal thing, the way politics works. Oh, by the way, there was a 57-41 vote that broke along party lines and signaled the death of legislation meant to blunt the impact of the Supreme Court decision about money in politics. And Harry Reid's office put out this announcement saying, the only way we can get anything done is with the cooperation of Republicans. Just acknowledging when you have the 41 votes against you, you're in a hard place. Now, what about the unwritten Constitution? I mean, our politics works by the written Constitution, partisan swings, and also the unwritten Constitution of kind of what are the norms of politics. Tocqueville talks about this. And here it's interesting to think that we do have times where the partisanship is not quite so vicious, we might say, where there is more cooperation. When that happens, some people would say, oh, the Senate's working better. Maybe we wouldn't agree with that. But ever since I can think we can agree, ever since the Gingrich Revolution, not the Reagan time, because Reagan got the cooperation of Democrats both as governor of California and when he was president. But Gingrich kind of started the time when Republicans decided to play hardball all the time, almost all the time, that they could. And so the book you talk about, Brownstein's book, there's other books like that, I mention it, where you have this extreme partisanship. Is that good or bad? Final thoughts, just to wrap up. I don't want to say I'm totally opposed to the small-sized states. In fact, when I was younger, I went off, just out of college, I went off to work for Frank Church. My one foray into kind of elective politics, or one of a couple when I was early in my youth after college. And I did advanced work for Frank Church in his final campaign. He was one of the senators that got beat in 1980 by the Reagan landslide. He lost by a half point in Idaho. And the feeling of politics in a state like Nevada or with a small population or a lot of the smaller states in terms of constituents and how they can connect, and I think also for the senators themselves, it's a much easier thing. It's much more possible to have kind of a retail style of politics to still have that, versus if you're in California or New York, that's very difficult. It's very hard. So there are some things about the scale of politics for smaller states that are quite nice. So I'm not totally against the system we've got. But we do have to realize the impact it has in terms of policy. So the one reform in terms of the size that I'm throwing out is from my book, which is basically, maybe you can't do anything about the Senate, but maybe on the House side, what you could try, in terms of the national government as a whole, if you have 100 people in the Senate, 435, and a president, that's the only elected national officials we have, right? That's very few people for a country of 300 million people. Radical idea, but not that radical. If you take the town hall and the internet and you marry those two in a serious manner, and you did the town halls not like last summer's town halls with health care, which are kind of overrun by partisans or it's easy to pack crowds, but you did a random sample or you chose people by lot. And it would be effectively like, these citizen assemblies would be effectively like now what Tocqueville and John Stuart Mill talk about are city councils and school boards as being ways that people can participate. But the big issues are at the state level or federal. So what if we had a third local arena where you didn't have to run for office, you didn't have to campaign, because a lot of intelligent people would like to be involved in politics, have something smart to say, but they don't want to do the whole messy business of campaigning. And we asked these people to speak for us, just kind of put on the hat and act like it'd be the same time demand as a busy city council. So you could still have your career, right? You could still do whatever you do, and you could be this kind of super citizen. You could put on the hat of a super citizen. You meet 2 or 3 times a month. You're online with your friends. It's 100 people, and they look at the biggest issues in the country. The really big issues, not the small stuff in Congress, but the big issues, so health care. And even Frank Luntz, I saw him recently, 6 months ago, and he said if we'd done something like that at the beginning of the health care debate, that might have been interesting to see what people thought. That actually looked at the proposals from the Republicans and the Democrats and had a dialogue in each congressional district of 100 people of a random sample, so you get this cross-section of the population, and then put those people together in a network, and ask them to vote, and, what do you think? And the piece I gave to you from the LA Times is saying, you wouldn't have to do that with a constitutional change. That's basically just something you could add as a piece and an adjunct piece to the Constitution. And that's starting to happen. I mean, there's been these town hall exercises. America Speaks does them. They did stuff in California. They did stuff post-Katrina. They just did something about the budget where they had 20 cities across the country, right? So that's happening. That may pick up some speed sometime. The final thought is, just on the Senate itself, what if I could wave my magic wand, and because of the ratification of a constitutional amendment, it's impossible, okay? It's not going to happen. But what would be a fair thing? I would say keep the Senate as it is. Some people say change the Senate all the way and have Texas or Florida or New York have, 4 or 5 people elected to the Senate instead of 1 or 8 people. Or, you keep this proportional representation. But in my book and here, I like to keep as much of the American system set as we've got it. So we're used to having 100 senators. We like that. And in my paper, I talk about Lyndon Johnson and how he loved the Senate size. So what if you had 100 senators, this is my wrap-up, but you gave them different weights of their votes? So if you were from Vermont or from North Dakota, you'd have 1 vote. If you're from a slightly larger state, you get 2 as an individual. But if you're from New York, you get 4, right? And you weight the votes so that Texas and Florida, New York would have like 4 votes per senator, 8 votes really, versus North Dakota or Vermont would have 2 votes because their population is so small. That would be a much fairer system. And it would be interesting to think about policy and politics in the U.S. if we had something like that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bill Connelly, you may present from your seat or use the podium. It's up to you.
I'll stay here, Don. Thanks. Thank you very much. And Kevin, thank you very much for getting us off to a good start. According to some today, we are in the midst of a second civil war characterized by off-center, freak show, fight club politics, complete with a broken branch Congress. These are all titles of recent books. Our politics, they argue, is marred by a bitter partisan polarization, a permanent campaign, and gridlock. Neither the problem nor the criticism is new. Both have been with us off and on since the founding. Neo-progressives like Lloyd Cutler and James McGregor Burns, and progressives like Herbert Crowley and Woodrow Wilson leveled many of these charges for over a century. But they were not the first. Prior to ratification of the Constitution, the Anti-Federalists critics had similar complaints. The persistence of this line of criticism for over 2 centuries suggests that it contains an element of truth. So how have we managed to muddle through the past 2 centuries, perhaps especially the last 2 decades, given the purported dangers of partisan polarization and paralysis? Is our constitutional system seriously endangered by today's contentious and confrontational partisanship? Are we failing to govern ourselves as a nation? In his new book, In Praise of Deadlock, How Partisan Struggle Makes Better Laws, Lee Rawls dares to defend both partisanship and gridlock. He even defends the oft-maligned Senate filibuster. Rawls argues that the filibuster promotes both gridlock and bipartisanship because the filibuster forces negotiation, thus requiring bipartisanship. So which do you want? Ending gridlock and ending partisanship are incompatible goals, he insists. Rawls also notes it is impossible to sort out the blame for partisanship. As both the Anti-Federalists and Woodrow Wilson complained, our complex separation of powers system precludes accountability. Trying to determine whether to blame Newt or Nancy is a fool's errand. Indeed, the partisan blame game itself is inherently political. Both parties are naturally partisan because both parties are partial. Neither ever represents the whole. Rawls is skeptical of nostalgia for the good old days of bipartisan comedy, citing the attack politics of the 1840s, the 1850s, the 1890s, as well as during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson. Periods of partisan quiescence or comedy are rarer. They're the exception more than the rule. The 1950s, a baseline the political scientists have used, or the era of good feeling in the early part of the 1900s. But they're perhaps more the exception than the rule. So we need to be careful about the golden age fallacy. Rawls pits the doom and gloom school of partisan paranoia against the what me worries school of thought, where the first sees gridlock, partisanship, and polarization. The second sees policy stability, a competitive two-party system, party unity, and principled opposition. Rawls cites David Mayhew and others who question whether increased polarization has hindered legislative productivity. President Obama's success with health care reform and financial regulation legislation in 2010, following his many legislative successes in 2009, calls into question the assumption that gridlock plagues our political system. Rawls further places partisan polarization in historical context. Historians Gordon Wood, James McPherson, and others conclude partisanship is mild by historical standards. Rawls argues, quote, the energy of American democracy comes from the parties. Similarly, John Hiley, in a fine book, The Challenge of Legislation, declares, quote, political competition has been a prime catalyst propelling the values, ideas, and policies through which the American consensus has emerged. And that progress has been contentious. Partisan competition has been at the center of our struggle to advance as a people and a nation. It has been our most important engine for adaptation and change, end quote. Now, James Madison and Alexis de Tocqueville both warned about the excess of lawmaking in American democracy. Madison noted, quote, the facility and excess of lawmaking seem to be diseases which our governments are most liable, end quote. The desire for activist government cannot be the standard by which we judge the system gridlocked. Madison sought to control the excess of lawmaking with his constitutional structure, including the separation of powers and bicameralism. I argue in my paper that our constitutional system controls the parties more than the parties control the Constitution. Thanks in part to the separation of powers, bicameralism, and federalism, strife within our parties is often as great as that between our parties. For example, during the recent health care reform debate, vituperation between Democrats in the House, the Senate, and the White House easily rivaled their anger at the other party. Similarly, the bitterness and invective between the Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton camps during the 2008 nomination contest eclipsed the contentiousness between Obama and Republican John McCain during the general election. Is intra-party factionalism preferable to inter-party factionalism? Internal party factionalism is an example of the Constitution governing the parties more than the parties governing the Constitution. So too is partisanship. Our parties are creatures of our constitutional system. Contrary to the conventional wisdom today, the separation of powers is not reducible to the checks and balances, though we often make that presumption. We can blame Woodrow Wilson and before him the Whigs for this common contemporary misunderstanding of the separation of powers. Rather, the founders sought to create limited yet effective government by means of a functional separation of three distinct branches, each exercising particular powers. The Federalists were not at all content with the ineffective government of the Articles of Confederation. In its place, they designed the constitutional separation of powers to promote, quote-unquote, stability and energy, to impede, end quote, to impede change and advance innovation. A contemporary example may be the way in which the 1997 Budget Accord followed upon the 1995-96 government shutdown. Gridlock gave way to governing. In fact, the former, gridlock, was predicate for the latter, according to Dan Palazzolo in his fine book, Done Deal. Some today say the founders were anti-party. Yet James Madison concluded, quote, parties seem to have a permanent foundation in the variance of political opinion in free states. The Constitution itself must be an unfailing source of party distinction, end quote. Congressional partisanship is rooted in the Constitution. In fact, the very debate today over partisanship and gridlock is rooted in the Constitution. Some today insist the founders did not expect political parties to form. The parties only rose later in American history. But in the 1792 essay titled A Candid State of Parties, Madison outlines the state of parties at the time. Madison concludes party distinctions are, quote, natural to most political societies and will likely endure, even to this day, perhaps. Admittedly, A Candid State of Parties is a partisan tract, just as were the Federalist Papers. Madison, as the founder, was a statesman, a politician, a political theorist, and a partisan. And this is not a criticism. Some of my best friends are Democrats and Republicans. Certainly the founders' practice of their principles in the first decade of the new republic suggests they were hardly anti-party. Their ardent partisanship during the 1790s provides evidence that sharp partisanship is a normal and natural part of our politics. It is worth remembering, too, that during the 1950s, political scientists were openly longing for the greater partisanship of a more disciplined and responsible two-party system, providing a choice, not an echo. Perhaps we should be careful what we wish for. Now we've gotten it. The pluralist incrementalists of the 1950s and the partisanship of today may both be compatible with our constitutional order. Perhaps American politics oscillates between in all politics is local pluralism and in all politics is national approximation of party government. Perhaps our politics oscillates across the decades, as witnessed the disaggregation of the 1950s and the polarization of today. Or perhaps our politics oscillates within presidential terms. The bipartisanship of George W. Bush's first term, as seen in passage of No Child Left Behind, who can forget Teddy Kennedy and George smiling at each other at the State of the Union address, contrasts with the bitter partisanship during his second term. Perhaps American politics alternates within congressional terms, with the first year of a new Congress producing more policy and the second year giving way to politics as the next election approaches. Finally, perhaps American politics fluctuates depending on the issues. For example, partisan warfare in the 2008 election year gave way repeatedly to bipartisan cooperation on Capitol Hill to deal with the looming economic and financial crisis, for example, TARP. And notice, the media made much of partisan conflict in 2008, yet little noted bipartisan cooperation when it occurred. The media covers politics the way they cover weather. Everything's a storm story. Again, there may be a reason rooted in the Constitution for the oscillating of our politics. Nelson Polsby recognized the role, quote, of innovation and stalemate, end quote, built into our constitutional routines. Quote, it is possible to discern an alternating and somewhat overlapping pattern of activity and retrenchment, of focus and stalemate in congressional affairs, end quote. He added, quote, neither one mode nor the other is exclusively natural to Congress. Both roles are historically characteristic of Congress, and both fully express the powers of Congress as contemplated in the overall constitutional design, end quote. Again, the separation of powers promotes both energy and stability, innovation and deliberation, because the separation of powers both humbles and empowers Democrats and Republicans, the majority party and the minority party, President and Congress, though at different times and on different issues. In Federalist 10, Madison notes the principal task of modern legislation is the regulation of various and interfering interests, which, quote, involves the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operation of government. People remember that Federalist 10 was about factions. The only word used as often as factions is the word party, party being, of course, a majority faction. So government is going to involve the spirit of party and faction in the necessary and ordinary operations. Madison's Constitution incorporates both the mischiefs of faction and the spirit of party. American politics encompasses both intense minorities and aspiring majorities, both special interest groups and majority-seeking parties. The Constitution checks and balances special interests and political parties. The Constitution also embraces and empowers special interests and political parties. Arguably, partisan confrontation between political parties both constitutes and corrupts our politics. Congressional politics may be a pendulum swing between compromise and confrontation, bipartisanship and partisanship, like two halves of a whole. Thus, the ebb and flow of partisanship is a natural part of our constitutional system, and in and of itself provides evidence of the dynamic rather than static character of the separation of powers. One cause of partisan polarization has been the effort to advance comprehensive non-incremental reform. For example, the decision by Democrats to advance health care reform may, by its very nature, have been partisan in the sense it raised fundamental questions about the role of government. Whether you agree or disagree with health care reform, it is a significant achievement. If you like Obamacare, then don't lament the resulting increased partisan polarization caused by the clash between the two parties, each of whom, on principle, stand for two very different understandings of the role of government. The same might be said on the other side of the partisan divide about dramatic attempts to re-limit government, contrary to already settled consensus. Privatizing Social Security is one example. The principal difference between the two parties matter. Sometimes partisan warfare serves a larger purpose. But it is not just attempts at comprehensive reform that invite partisan polarization. The long-term growth of government in general may be feeding the scourge of partisan polarization. James Q. Wilson once observed that at one time government was about a few things, whereas today it is about everything. Like Lee Rawls and Nelson Polsby, Charles O. Jones notes, quote, the impressive creativity and flexibility, end quote, of our separation of powers system. Jones argues gridlock may be good. Gridlock may be a form of governing. Quote, the prevention of legislation may also represent effective governance, end quote. At times, the status quo may be preferable to legislative change. Who has not agreed with that observation at one time or another? For example, Republicans on the 2010 health care reform. Or, for example, the Pelosi-led Democrats on Bush's Social Security initiative in 2005-2006. Limited government as opposed to activist government may at times be desirable, regardless of your partisan predilections. At the same time, the notion that the separation of powers is reducible to the checks and balances and inevitably produces gridlock is at a minimum incomplete, if not inaccurate. In fact, Congress brings energy to the legislative process precisely because power is fragmented and decentralized, unleashing the entrepreneurial ambitions of individual members. Jones concludes, quote, federalism, separation of powers, and jurisdictional overlaps are opportunities for change as much as inhibitors of change, end quote. Multiple veto points, as they're often called, may in fact be multiple access points in our complex legislative process. Sidney Milkus, another political scientist, underscores another argument. Partisanship can be good by rousing us from our slumber, overcoming the blight of apathy and alienation. Political parties inspire debate, increase voter turnout. Again, the Federalists sought more, not less effective and energetic government, as opposed to the Anti-Federalists defending the Articles of Confederation. They sought to empower government. The Federalists sought to empower government rather than weaken it, as has so often been assumed, at least since Woodrow Wilson. As Marvin Myers notes, Marvin Myers being perhaps the leading Madison scholar, Madison, quote, never forgot that it was a twofold process, arresting the abuse of power and promoting the use of power for the public interest, cancellation and summation, end quote. Gridlock may at times define our politics until a sudden breakthrough results in significant change. Sometimes these breakthroughs take the form of partisan electoral victories, followed by a flurry of legislative activity, such as 1994 and 2006, or even more dramatically, 1932, 1964, or 1980. Or breakthroughs in legislative productivity may be responses to overwhelming majority sentiment, for example, the bipartisan legislative activism following 9/11, the Patriot Act, Homeland Security, etc. Other times, breakthroughs take the form of bipartisan compromises, following closely on the heels of bitter partisan contention, such as the 1986 Tax Reform Act, the 1996 Welfare Reform Act, and the 1997 Budget Accord. At times, gridlock and partisanship may be a necessary predicate to energetic change. It is worth noting the founders' practice of their principles. Historian Joseph Ellis describes the 1790s as a decade-long shouting match, unparalleled in American history. Gordon Wood says in the 1790s, quote, party spirit ruled all, end quote. Partisan and personal differences in the 1790s were sharp, significant, and often rooted in competing constitutional interpretations. We call them Hamiltonian Jeffersonian today, just like today. Clearly, Madison and Hamilton were, in retrospect, statesmen, though they were also successful statesmen in part because they were party statesmen and partisan. Allied with one another against the critics of the Constitution during the ratification debate, these two founders found themselves increasingly at odds during the early years of the Republic. Although Newt Gingrich and Nancy Pelosi may not be the statesmen we rightly understand Madison and Hamilton to be, still our two founders were certainly part and parcel of the politics, partisanship, polarization of the early years of the American Republic. One lesson all four leaders learned in their time: majorities fall, but the Congress and the Constitution stand. We're not that threatened by partisanship. The founders were partisans. To the Jeffersonian Republicans, Federalists were undisguised monarchists. To the Federalists, Republicans were Jacobins in disguise. Political rhetoric matched the polarized politics. Jefferson saw the Federalists under Adams as seditious and treasonable. John Adams' supporters tarred his opponent, Thomas Jefferson, as an atheist, an anarchist, demagogue, coward, mountebank, trickster, and Francomaniac. And you thought Newt and Nancy were bad. Certainly our First Amendment freedom of the press and freedom of association allow and even invite the abuse of licentiousness and excessive partisanship. But what is the alternative? Madison understood that in a free society, politics, including the spirit of party, is ubiquitous. It's like the old nostrum about a man who says he's not interested in politics, like a drowning man who says he's not interested in water. It's ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Since the latent cause of faction and the spirit of party are natural to man, Madison sought to control the effects of factions rather than removing their causes. Madison did not seek to take the spirit of party out of politics. He did not share Madison did not share Jefferson's pretense to rising above partisanship. Jefferson may have been willing to forego heaven if his only option was to go there with the party, but not Madison. Madison clearly understood, quote, in every political society, parties are unavoidable, end quote. In fact, he concluded parties, quote, must always be expected in a government as free as ours, end quote. Madison recognized that American politics and partisanship are rooted in the Constitution. Mere partisanship is possible precisely because of limited constitutional government. The Constitution governs parties more than the parties govern the Constitution. Our constitutional concrete is sufficient to withstand partisan warfare today, just as it did in the 1790s. Partisanship is rooted in the Constitution because of our First Amendment freedoms, yet partisanship is also rooted in the Constitution in another fundamental way. Throughout our history, beginning in the 1790s, partisanship has been premised on the fault lines of constitutional debate and interpretation over the central principles of separation of powers and federalism. In sum, contentious partisanship has its roots in the Constitution. Madison saw politics as essentially partisan. Quote, "No free country has ever been without parties, which are a natural offspring of freedom," end quote. Compromise and confrontation are both inherent in our politics. Indeed, American politics may be, as Samuel Huntington suggests, the promise of disharmony. Our other two key mediating institutions, interest groups and the media, are also complicit in today's pronounced disharmony. In Party Wars, her classic study of partisanship, Barbara Sinclair concludes, quote, "Partisan polarization cannot be blamed for many of the features of contemporary politics that we do not like, such as ugly politics. The fragmentation of the press and the hyper-pluralism of our interest group system bear some responsibility." In conclusion, in a recent New Yorker essay, George Packer argued that the United States Senate is broken, basing his argument in part on the complaints of some Senate Democrats. Yet Packer notes, quote, "None of the Republicans I spoke to agreed with the contention that the Senate is broken," end quote. He quotes Republican Senator Lamar Alexander suggesting Democrats will change their tune about the filibuster and holds just as soon as they're in the minority. Packer also cites retiring Democratic Senator Chris Dodd criticizing his junior colleagues' interest in rules reform. Quote, "These people have never been in the minority," end quote. Certainly, Madison would appreciate Dodd's institutional insight, namely, where you sit influences what you think. Institutions affect behavior. Finally, rather than criticize the Constitution or call for fundamental constitutional reform with all its potential unintended consequences, perhaps we should try instead to understand the Constitution with its latent potential for both partisanship and bipartisanship, conflict and compromise, limited and effective government, stability and energy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. Gregory Koger.
Thank you. All right. Happy Constitution Day. I thought one way that I could contribute to the conversation is by focusing on an area of governance where I could systematically study how well our constitutional system is working. And that area is the federal appropriations process, which is nice because it's quite clear exactly what the job of Congress and the President is on a year-by-year basis. Let me first note that the authors of the Constitution considered the appropriations power to be central to the role of Congress in our constitutional system. First, by specifying that money cannot be spent except with the permission of Congress through an appropriations bill. And then throughout the Federalist Papers, there are numerous references to how important this power is to Congress. Because with the power of the purse, it can keep a check on the foreign policy and the day-to-day behavior of the executive branch. One quote is here from Federalist 58. The power over the purse may in fact be regarded as the most complete and effectual weapon with which any constitution can arm the immediate representatives of the people. So, great. Our Congress has the power to keep the executive branch in check. In the modern institutional system, though, the power of the purse is in fact the curse of the purse, because Congress struggles to actually make use of this power. As of today, the job of Congress is to pass 12 appropriations bills to fund the discretionary part of the budget, that is every single agency which requires annual appropriations. In 2009, that amounted to $2.1 trillion in appropriations. And we know exactly when they're supposed to do this job. They are supposed to finish passing each of these appropriations bills by the beginning of the new fiscal year, which is October 1st. But they don't do that. As a regular practice now, if Congress does not meet its deadline for one of these bills or more, they have the ability to procrastinate by saying, well, let's keep on spending on last year's level or some percentage of last year's spending level until we get our act together. And that's known as continuing resolution. Even with the ability to procrastinate, though, Congress struggles to do its job. So just going back over the last 20 years or so, starting in 1990, calendar year 1991, so fiscal year 92, Congress has increasingly delayed how long it takes to complete its appropriations bills. So this chart shows the mean and median time, number of days to complete the set of appropriations bills for a given year. And there's two things to note. One is that there are spikes over time. This is the government shutdown debates of 1995-96. But there's also a general trend towards taking longer and longer for Congress to complete its bills. The other trend to note is that Congress is, when I say Congress is completing its bills, more and more often Congress completes its bills by completing one bill or just a few, because they take these 12 or 13 appropriations bills and they bundle them together into omnibus bills, so that the bills for fiscal year 2009, which should have been passed by October 1st, 2008, were actually not passed until March 2009. And when they passed as one big bundle. And then occasionally Congress says, well, in order to do a little bit of our job, we will bundle up one of our appropriations bills with our continuing resolution, because that seems to be the one thing that actually has to get through the system. We have to pass a continuing resolution or else the whole government will shut down. We don't want to do that. And so we'll tack a bill onto that. And that's one way to sort of force this system to act. So now to show this graphically. So I just compared a couple fiscal years. This is fiscal year 93. So these are the bills being written in 1992, a presidential election year with divided government, and there's some delay in the system. The House is the number of days here in yellow. The Senate is the number of days in red. And it's probably hard to read this at the back, but these are the actual bills that they were debating. And then blue is the amount of time between Senate passage and completion. And this line is the beginning of the fiscal year, October 1st, 1992. And yes, most bills get right over the line, because if you give Congress a deadline, they will meet that deadline plus a few days. Fine. That's 1992. Divided government, presidential election year. This is last year, fiscal year 2009. So not an election year. You've got Democrats in control of Congress. They've got one party speaking one unified message. They've got a budget resolution to tell them what to do. And yet, they still failed to pass their bills in anything close to on time. So again, House, Senate, 3 of the bills just never passed the Senate at all. They just punted on trying to get these bills through the Senate. And most of them, some of them passed right about the deadline. 4 of them passed in mid-November, and then the rest mid-December. Under optimum conditions for passing appropriations bills. Okay, so the paper, which has been handed out, and I encourage it if you like statistical analysis, tries to explain what's behind this delay. And so it takes all 227 regular appropriations bills from 1991 to 2009 and tries to explain, why they take as long as they do. Long story short, one source, as you might imagine, is policy disagreement. This includes divided government. So if the House, the Senate, and the President just have different ideas about the role of government or about how much money ought to be spent, well, certainly that's going to lead to some disagreement. But as we just saw, that doesn't explain everything, because even in 1992, they managed to come together. Also, presidential election years, there tends to be more delay because there's posturing going on, and also because the majority party in Congress might find it believe that it's in its own interest to just wait until the next president is elected, and then they can negotiate with a friend rather than a opponent. Third, Senate filibusters. This is a critique that's been very popular in the discussion of the Senate over the last year and a half. But what I found was that if a bill has to face a Senate filibuster, or more precisely, if there's a cloture vote on an appropriations bill, that accounts for a large amount of the delay that goes on as well. And that's not even counting the bills that never come up in the Senate because, for whatever reason, it's just too difficult to try to pass them. And then the last thing that contributes to the delay is the use of omnibus packages. So maybe one bill is ready to go, but they're waiting for the others to get halfway through the process and they can all be bundled together. Well, if you can't pass these bills by themselves because it's just too hard to actually vote on them, then you end up holding some bills in limbo while you wait for the others to get prepared to bundle into the omnibus bill. So that's another source of delay. One thing that I found did not seem to have much influence on how well Congress processed these bills is the amount of money involved. So if you compare it, I thought going in that maybe Congress has an easier time passing bills when it's spending more money than the president had proposed. So if you juice the system with more cash, then maybe you make everybody happy and then the bill gets passed. Actually, no. So it causes a delay. So that's what my statistical analysis indicates. This paper is actually something I've been working on, will continue to work on. It's one of the things that I think is also part of the problem that my measures don't get at, is just the sheer difficulty that Congress seems to have making decisions that aren't fun or easy right now. So an appropriations bill is, proposed level of spending on dozens of items, hundreds if you go into the fine detail of reports, and you can't please everybody, and so an appropriations bill is by necessity a compromise. And it used to be easier for Congress to sort of endorse the compromises that have been made and get on with their lives, and it seems much more difficult to embrace the compromises that are part of the appropriations process in the modern Congress. So quickly, some ways that either the congressional system or the constitutional system might be amended. One, which has been bandied about for years, is to switch to a 2-year appropriation cycle, which might still have the same dysfunction, but we'd only do it every other year. Another thing is just to reduce the number of appropriations bills. If in the end we're going to pass 1 or 2 or 3 bills and bundle the rest, and some of those are going to be bundled together because you can't pass, say, a labor HHS bill all by itself, then we might as well admit that and just try to pass 3 bills a year. Third, a proposal that's been endorsed by, among others, Norm Ornstein, to make appropriations bills immune to filibusters, which might make it easier to get them through the Senate, but not necessarily to make sure that there are healthy compromises and make it out of the House and then make it out of conference and then get the president to strike a deal. But it might address one of the barriers to completion. And then, just for fun, I threw in a couple of ways that you might make it worth Congress's while to approve its bills on time. First is, in several of these years, the first bill to get approved by Congress was legislative appropriations. So they get their bill signed into law, and then the other bills, they get passed when they get passed. Well, if legislative appropriations had to go last, then Congress might have to endure the inconvenience of life under a CR more often, and then that might accelerate their enthusiasm for passing appropriations bills on time. And the second is to set up a firm default setting for what happens if appropriations bills don't get passed, and that is essentially 90% CR, so that if Congress doesn't act, there will be spending cuts for every agency affected by these bills. And that would create enough political pain that Congress would rather approve its bills on time than endure the blowback from not passing bills on time. Anyway. And with that, I'm done.
Thank you. Congressman Mickey Edwards.
Thanks, Don. I'm not going to say anything about that last one since I was on appropriations. And I don't know whether I was responsible for holding it all up or not. So as I understand what happens here is that the question is the constitutional system broken? Kevin's position is that no, the system works. The problem is the Constitution is broken. Bill responds that no, the Constitution is fine. The system is not broken. Well, Greg makes the point Congress is slow. Well, we know that. So I'm going to, I'm going to take the only position that is left, which is that the Constitution's fine, but the system is broken. And I want to go through at least 3 different reasons that I think the system is broken. I do want to make a couple of comments about what some of the earlier speakers said, just very briefly. I wanted to respond to something Kevin said. I think the problem with pure democracy and majority rule is that we would not have passed civil rights legislation. Women would not be voting. That there are reasons, that the founders were very cautious about leaving everything open to the public. And in fact, you've cited California, where California in the legislative process requires, you said, a 2/3 vote on budget and spending. But when issues in California are taken to the electorate as a whole, where you have democracy through the referendum or initiative process, the result has been an amazing fiscal crisis that has brought California to its knees, by a state that wants to spend everything and tax nothing. So I think there are, I don't think that going to a pure majoritarian system, with apologies to Dahl, who I know has made that point over and over again, and he, it just doesn't relate to the concerns the founders had when they created the system. They did. I wanted to say, I don't want a system where decisions are made primarily in response to what was heard the night before on Beck, Limbaugh, Maddow, or Olbermann. So, I think there's a danger in going that way. I do want to say, Bill, even though you and I agree a lot, I think it's important to make a distinction between polarization and partisanship. They are not the same. Polarization is necessary and a vital part of a democratic system. Partisanship is not. And I want to get into that. So, okay, here is my general reasons for believing that we have some quite serious problems in our system. In a system of democratic rule, democratic self-government, which is the system that our founders created, one of the measures of success is whether or not the public has confidence in the system, whether or not the shareholders, the citizens, have confidence in the system that they've created. And it's fairly obvious that that's not the case. In every poll, people have no confidence in the president. They have no confidence in the Congress. They think the system is broken. They are taking it out currently in elections where the worst thing you can do when you're running this year, it has nothing to do with being Democrat or Republican, or not even necessarily how you voted. It's just the fact that you're there. The fact that if you are somebody who is there or has been there, it's time for you to go. That happens a lot, but it's one sign of the lack of confidence. But I want to mention another one. Let me start with just this little, because I was a fan of Ronald Reagan's. I like anecdotes. Tell you this little story in my own life that I think illustrates the problem. When I was sworn in as a member of Congress, I was really kind of excited. I mean, I thought I was taking a big step here. I had gone from being a candidate, running the usual kind of election, which includes debates about issues and partisan statements and so forth. But then I stepped across that magic line to become an actual member of the United States Congress. And I was sworn in, and I raised my hand, and I took the oath. There were a group of us who were all freshmen together, new members of this prestigious body, Al Gore and Dick Gephardt and Dan Quayle and, David Stockman, people who were in my class. I know it reveals my age, but there we were. We had this one thing in common. Gore and Gephardt and I, we had the thing in common. We were the United States Congress. That lasted 30 seconds. Because as soon as we were sworn in, we voted to elect a speaker. And every single Democrat voted one way, and every single Republican voted the other way. And then we voted to set up the rules of the House. And the Democrats supported the rules because they had written them. The Republicans did not. Then we voted on how we were going to divide up the committees, how many members on each committee, and how many of the majority party versus the minority party. And so our unity as coming in together as members of a collective group, the United States Congress, lasted a very short time, and immediately we became two rival political groups whose goal in life was to stop the other guys. And it has gotten worse ever since. So, there's let me just give a comparison. I can't do all this numbers stuff, but just a comparison of something that I think is kind of interesting about the lack of confidence that people have in the system and how they feel that somehow government isn't working the way they think it should. Two numbers. 40% of the American electorate has declared itself to be independent, unaffiliated, unenrolled, or in any other terminology that is used in their own particular states, not part of either the Democratic or the Republican Party. 40% of the voters have repudiated both political parties. They don't want anything to do with the political parties. On the other hand, most of the members of the United States Senate and House brag about the fact that they vote 90% or more of the time with their party. So while the public is moving away from making decisions based on loyalty to your private power-seeking club, inside the institutions of Congress, inside the House and the Senate, you are governed and driven by what's to the advantage of your private club, going in two opposite directions at the same time. And that is why it really doesn't matter. Think about the demographics. On the Democratic side and on the Republican side, you have on both sides, you have men and women. You have people who are wealthy and people who are not. You have people from urban areas and you have people from rural areas. You have people well-educated and people less well-educated. You have all of these varieties of constituencies and personal experiences, and yet whether the issue is Sonia Sotomayor or Elena Kagan or stimulus or TARP or tax cuts or cap and trade or whatever it is, all the Democrats are on one side, the Republicans are on the other side. Now, when you start in the process, my view is, when I was elected to Congress, that there were three things that should govern how I cast my vote on every issue. The first was the views of my constituents and the preferences and the interests of my constituents. I'm a Burkean. Not to automatically do whatever your constituents wanted, but to take it seriously. One thing our Constitution did that people never talk about was a real break from the European systems by saying that if you're in the House or the Senate, you have to be a resident of the state from which you are elected. There is an obligation of representation to be aware of the concerns and the interests of a constituency. That's number one. The second thing is the Burkean model. Use your head. Think. Get information. Understand the issues. And try the best you can to apply your intellect, your judgment to what's the best outcome for the country as a whole. And then third, and I will say this, it's the most important, but it's also part of today, is it constitutional? I throw that in because quite often members of Congress don't care if it's constitutional. They care about what's the outcome they want, which is why we had crazy ideas like line item veto and term limits, which were things where they were unconstitutional on their face, and yet passed by Congress saying, well, the courts will take care of it. So we have that problem. That's a major problem, where you have this partisanship, which is due in part because state and local governments have ceded control of the election process to these two rival political clubs. And therefore, by allowing these two private clubs, the Republicans and the Democrats, to control access to the ballot, to control who you as a voter can choose between, you have examples like these that you're very familiar with. Utah has a population of almost 3 million people. Robert Bennett was their senator for quite a long time. It is quite possible that the people of Utah would have reelected Bennett to the Senate, but 3,500 people out of those 3 million, meeting in a small convention, decided he could not be on the ballot. In Delaware, the election that was just held, there are 900,000 people. I'm not going to get into how many senators they should have, but 900,000 people, and at least one of those senators, who that is going to partly be determined by a primary that was held this week, in which out of those 900,000 people, 30,000 voted for the person who got the nomination, and therefore will be one of the two people who are on the ballot in November. To use a different example, this paper was kind of sent around. It wasn't meant as a paper for this, but Don sent it around. In Arizona, where Ben Quayle, and I have no problem with Ben, Ben Quayle just won the Republican nomination for the U.S. House in a district where the Democratic Party is virtually non-existent. He got 22% of the vote, so 78% of the voters in his own party who went to the polls, which was a small number, didn't want him. But because there's really no Democrats who have a chance of getting elected in that district, he will be a House member, just as many members of the Massachusetts delegation who got 19% or 20% in a multi-party race, but they didn't have runoffs, just like Arizona doesn't have runoffs. And so the party controlled who was going to get these seats. You also have the problem, to carry it a step further, in terms of dependency on the party and the redistricting process. Because the redistricting process is not done by the states as it should. It's left to the parties. So you have the state legislatures in which the majority party in the state legislature, if uncontrolled by a governor who is also operating for the advantage of his party, they draw the district lines. So when I was in Congress, my district, after I had the temerity, and I apologize to anybody who's offended by it, to win in a Democratic district. My district, I was the first Republican in my district elected since 1928. I'm not that old. My district was 74% Democrat, and I won anyway. And so after deciding they couldn't beat me, they redrew my lines. All of New England would fit inside of Oklahoma. That's how big it is. And yet my district stretched, when they got through redistricting it, from the center of Oklahoma up to the Kansas line and then halfway over to the Arkansas line, because the idea was that if as many Republicans as could be found in the state could be shoved into my district, since they figured they couldn't beat me, they could take those Republicans out of other districts and increase the chances of Democrats winning those seats. So, and what did that mean in terms of representation and being a good member of Congress? You can't see this, but I'm wearing loafers. I am a city dude. And after they redid my district, I represented one of the largest wheat-growing districts in America. Cattle ranchers, I didn't understand any of their issues. They were very tolerant about it for a long time, but the idea that I was supposed to understand and know and represent their concerns was pretty well shot because of the parties seeking partisan advantage for the votes in Congress. So that's one of the problems. I will say, and I know, I just want to say this, Bill, if you don't mind. When Madison warned about factions, but then said we're going to have them and set it up so factions would control each other, this is a major mistake political science makes. I'm sorry. When Madison and the founders talked about factions, they did not have in mind the current political party system in which members of one club or the other vote constantly all the time on big issues and small issues. It meant that some were pro-French, some were pro-British, some were pro-tariff, some were not. But on issue after issue, they were not in lockstep. That isn't what it meant. They believed in faction, but they didn't believe in the kind of political party that you have now. Okay, very quickly, I want to do two other examples of where I think we have, where I think the system is failing. One is, partly it's because of this. Partly it's for whatever reasons that might have been, uncovered in Greg's study. The Congress fails to deal with the most important issues facing the country. Simply doesn't deal with them. The huge deficit. And you can have great debates about what to do about taxes or what to do about spending or what to do about entitlements. But the problem goes on. We are drowning in deficit, and it goes on. And, whether you're in Tea Party or Coffee Party, you understand that this is a problem that your government is not dealing with. You may think the people in Arizona are a bunch of kooks, or you may think they're a bunch of patriotic heroes. I don't care what you think, but the fact is what they're doing is reacting to the fact that the government does not control immigration, has lost all control of its borders. And I just came from participating in another program. We are under constant attack from Al-Qaeda and other people who want to do great harm to us. And even after all this time, we still do not have rules for how to try suspected terrorists, when they should be tried in a Article 3 court or when they should be tried in a military commission. We're kind of leaving that up to the president. I should point out, this is going to be a great shock to everybody here, I know, because it is to a lot of people. Dana Milbank wrote a column about the president, it was George Bush at the time, going overseas to meet with people about basing rights and all this stuff, and he was stepping out of his role as head of government to function in his other role as head of state. And I asked my students at Princeton, well, what jumps out at you about that statement? So it's, well, it's basing rights or it's trade agreement. No, the president's not the head of government. We don't have a head of government. Try to tell people in Congress that, who don't understand the system, their obligations, their duties, and their responsibilities. And so that brings me to the third issue about why we are in this mess. The president gives a State of the Union message, not because he has the authority to come down and tell us and tell the Congress what should be done. It's because the Constitution orders the president to report to Congress. The president submits a budget, which starts which is the starting point for how you then act about your appropriations. He doesn't do that because it is the president's job to decide spending. He does that because the Congress passed legislation telling the president to submit a budget. In fact, every major power is in the Congress, the final say on going to war, on spending, and therefore creating programs, on taxing. Our congressional powers and congressional obligations and congressional duties. And yet we do, you can think of a lot of different examples. I'm just going to give you a couple that jump out at me about how the Congress has ceded its responsibility and failed to understand it. In 1973, the Congress passed the War Powers Act. And they did that. I don't know if there was anybody in Congress in 73 who had ever read the Constitution. They read it, they passed the War Powers Act as a way of asserting that they too would have some voice in whether or not we go to war. They would be able to be heard and act, at some point. And in doing so, even though the Constitution gives only the Congress the authority to declare war, in doing so, they gave the President the authority to initiate hostilities, create a military action, which they might then come in after the fact to try to stop. I served in Congress. I will tell you, if American troops are in combat, we are not going to cut off the supply of ammunition. So basically ceded control over military action. The second one, it's not similar, not at the same level, but it just puts it all in a nutshell, and I will stop with it. There's been a series of things. When President Bush issued hundreds of signing statements, you got to understand what the signing statements were. They were declarations by the President of the United States that he would decide for himself whether or not he had to obey the laws that Congress had enacted and that he had signed. Obama, of course, properly denounced that and now does the same thing himself. The Patriot Act, which has been referred to, was a model of a lack of serious deliberation, as was the declaration to go into Iraq in the first place. But the one that really I enjoy is this. The President, not only does the executive branch claim the sole right to declare what is classified or not, but the executive branch, not the President, by the way, the President sends some people who work for him to the Hill to share classified information up to a point with a gang of 8, 4 House members and 4 senators, who are not allowed to bring staff into the room, not allowed to tell staff what they were told, and not allowed to tell any other member of Congress what they were told. And the Congress goes along with it. I met with Nancy Pelosi, who is a good friend. We don't agree on a lot, but she's a friend. And I said to her, it's the fact that you're the first woman speaker is no big deal. There will be other women speakers in the future. The fact that you're the head of the party, at that moment she was, doesn't matter, because then you're going to have a nominee and he'll be the head of the party, and so you won't be. I said, what's going to decide your legacy is whether or not Congress becomes irrelevant on your watch. Congress became irrelevant on Denny Hastard's watch, who thought his job was to be the floor leader, for the president, as we've moved more and more toward a parliamentary system. And so we have the system of the Gang of 8. And is there a reason why the system is broken? It's because the Speaker of the House doesn't say to the President of the United States, you are not going to share with the Congress of the United States the information we need to make decisions about intelligence gathering, about how we treat detainees, about whether or not we go to war, whether our wars are succeeding or not. Well, then have fun trying to run your executive office without funds. But we don't do that. The Congress has given up its duties, its obligations. And so for all those reasons, I think not only do the people lack confidence in our government, I'm losing confidence in our government, and it is definitely broken.
Thank you, Mickey. Let me, before we open it up to the audience, allow any of the other panelists to follow up to comment on anything that they've heard that they would like to make a brief remark about. All right, Bill?
Both in Kevin's paper and in his comments, I was
Use the microphone there.
Both in Kevin's paper and his comments, I was intrigued by the idea of town halls and especially town halls using the internet. Actually sounds like a fine idea, but I think it's what we have. The August town halls, angry August town halls, or the Tea Party movement today, in some senses, precisely an example. So, Kevin, I guess I didn't see where you would distinguish between your proposal and what, in fact, we've seen over the last year.
Kevin, would you like to reply briefly?
I'll jump in on that. Because what I think, for all those talk some respect about the founders and the Constitution and Madison's goal, and one thing I mentioned in my book is that I think what Madison's goal was, what Samuel Beer once called a civic majority, which would be a coalition of the whole society, could seldom take place on any other principle than those of justice and the general good. And so what I'm trying to do with the citizen assembly idea is to allow a broad cross-section of the public to talk to each other. And that's different than the town halls. I mean, I think the town halls is not unhealthy what happened last August. If you're going to have partisan hot feelings, I'm not against that, right? But I'm saying you could add an element to the system where you tried to get, and that's what I did with this LA Times piece, to talk about a second slice of public opinion. We have all these polls that are out there, right? But a lot of times people are just too busy, even people who are engaged in political life like ourselves. If somebody calls you, it's so unexpected to get a call from Gallup. You didn't read, The Economist or Time or U.S. News or whatever. You haven't kept up on that particular issue they're talking about. If you actually grabbed a slice of the public and set them down and said, go through an issue and talk it through, I think that would be useful for representative governments and for people like Mickey in Congress to have another thing that they're looking at besides the poll saying the public's angry. Okay? So that's part of what I'm trying to get at. So that's different than what you're talking about.
How would you choose those people?
By random sample. I'm just saying by lot. Yeah, you could do the Greek system, which is what I endorse in my book, a lottery. So unless you're a woman who's just had twins, or you're a guy who's just starting a business and you just don't have any time, but there's lots of people who do. It might be something you get out of high school and you knew this was an opportunity once in a while. You would know a friend of a friend who got that chance in your district to be part of it. And I'm not saying you're going to take over the job of the person who's in Congress. That's not the point. But it's allow another way to have people have access. And I conclude the paper with a quote, just from the book, just the basic idea of what I'm trying to do.
Oh, you're looking up. I tell you, Jim Wright proposed that when he was Speaker.
I don't know his details.
Yeah.
But this network of local systems would give every American an equal chance to share in public power. I think if people knew that that was a possibility, they would be a little bit less frustrated with Washington. So just a couple points. I want to say on Mickey, I thought there was a little bit of a contradiction in your remarks where you were talking about that small was bad, where you were talking at the end of in the middle where you're talking about a small convention in Utah and small numbers in Delaware. But at the beginning when you were critiquing me, you were saying you didn't favor opening it up. What I want to say is I'm not in favor of direct democracy. My book makes a big point. I'm not in favor in California of the initiative system. What I'm talking about is another way. It's kind of like if you look at ways of thinking about democracy, and it's not too theoretical, we have representative democracy here and we have direct democracy here. Well, the progressives came up with a middle ground at the start of the century when they came up with the primary system and what other ways to get the public engaged. But they were taking direct democracy in mass. So the initiative came out of that point. When you kind of blow up direct democracy, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying talk from the representative pole, from Madison's pole of democracy, and come to the middle and think, how could we take representative democracy and do something interesting with that so it's still about representative democracy. It's not direct, where you'd have thoughtful, deliberative democracy as kind of the ideal is. And people would take some time, and they'd have different opinions. And you might have screaming in these citizen assemblies. It might be like August occasionally. But people would take the time to study an issue and think about it. And it would go back to Mickey's point, your point at the end, about Congress giving away power on national security issues. Ever since the Cold War and World War II, Congress has given away a lot of power. Since the Cold War ended, we're in a different realm. It would be quite possible, I think, now for people to be more engaged and for Congress to be more engaged on that. So that's what I'm trying to do in my proposal. So I'm not afraid of, I don't think we should be afraid of majority rule. We shouldn't be afraid of giving people more power, but we should try to have an intelligent, educated public opinion out there, try to help cultivate interest in politics and people to become more engaged and kind of bridge the gap. If you look at all the polls and the studies, there's a huge gap between the political elites in Washington and the state capitals and the mass public out there. Is there a way to kind of bridge that gap so people feel more engaged and that government is something that they sanction?
Okay, thanks. Greg, did you have any follow-up comments?
I want to say just a word about political parties. As Congressman Edwards points out, when Madison talks about factions, he's actually talking about something more like what we call interest groups, and not parties. In fact, the founders didn't expect that political parties would develop. And in my view, parties are not by their nature bad. I think, in fact, it'd be hard to fathom electing people and then making the government work in practice without political parties to organize the system we live in. I think when it becomes dangerous, or when there's a downside of political parties, is when the two parties see it in their interest to keep the other party from succeeding. And so the minority party does whatever it can to prevent any success by the majority party, because that would bolster the reputation of the majority, lower the reputation of the minority. And so I think that's where it becomes dissatisfying.
Okay.
May I respond to that?
Briefly, because I do want to allow this last half hour for questions from the audience, but go ahead.
My paper, and for that matter, the book I have on James Madison Rules America,
Use the microphone.
in part addresses directly that question whether the founders in fact expected parties. Again, Federalist 10 itself, the most common word other than the word factions is the word party. And the evidence in the paper, some of which I cited, where Madison talks about political parties, and in fact Madison was himself a partisan and an organizer of a party faction in the 50s. So both their practice and their theory of politics, I think, runs contrary to the conventional wisdom today, which is the founders were anti-party. And again, I would recommend the paper or the book.
Okay. With that, let's wait for a microphone, but when you do get it, give your name and affiliation, please. Let's start, gentleman there at the corner.
Hi, I'm Charlie Stevenson. I teach at SAIS. Okay, I'm persuaded that the system is broken, but I'd like the panelists to address the questions of quality and not just quantity. Mr. Connelly talks about how we've always had partisanship and polarization and so forth. I think what's happened recently that makes things worse is that these have had qualitative differences in what how the Congress functions. There's an increase in incivility, an increase in desocialization. Members don't socialize together the way they did even 40 years ago. And I think that has had a qualitative impact on the functioning of government, and it has probably exacerbated what Mr. Edwards talked about, the way the parties are so vicious toward each other. And with Mr. Koger, the question is, expand on the qualitative problems caused by the quantitative delays that you mentioned. I think the appropriations process doesn't work well because they do get everything jumbled up, and some bills never get considered by the people who are expert, and those things lead to a qualitative loss in oversight by the Congress and in the governance of it.
Well, let me quickly say that as Dr. Connelly points out, I mean, there are real differences in the viewpoints of the two political parties, but I actually think that a lot of the dysfunction that we observe is not based on just a sincere policy disagreements. That on top of what disagreements may exist, there's a lot of political strategy that goes into their inability to agree on appropriations bills. Maybe on healthcare, tax policy, there are real differences based on the public ideology of the two parties. But I actually think if you put the Republicans and Democrats in one very large room and said they couldn't leave until they came up with an agreement on immigration policy, it'd take about 2 hours. Because, I mean, they actually there seems to be a core of agreement within both parties about what needs to be done. But the hang-up is it is not in the interests of both parties to enact that agreement right now.
Okay. Anybody else want to address that question? Bill?
Just very briefly, the question of incivility due to lack of socialization among members of Congress. Norm Ornstein, I think, has proposed an idea of instead of having a Tuesday or Thursday club on Capitol Hill where members are only here for 3 days, that instead we'd have something like 3 weeks in D.C. and 1 week back in the constituency where members would get to know each other better. I could endorse that idea, but any member of Congress is caught sort of in a damned if you do, damned if you don't, damned if you do, damned if you don't position. They have to be close to their colleagues and close to their constituents. They have to be responsive to their constituents. They have to behave in a responsible fashion, legislating in the interests of the nation as a whole. So that problem you're never going to eliminate. They're caught between their constituents and their colleagues.
Okay. Let's go with Flip Strum first and then Stephen Shore.
Philippa Strum, I'm senior scholar at the Wilson Center. Thank you all so much. I have a question for Kevin O'Leary, but I don't know whether the rest of you would want to address it, having to do with the nature of democracy. Don started us off by talking about the Pew poll and the people saying that Washington is broken. I doubt very much that the majority of people polled would say that the Constitution is broken. I think they would differentiate, and I think if they were better informed, they would take Mickey Edwards' position, showing what it is in the use of the constitutional system that has gone wrong. But putting what the people might or might not say aside for the moment, you suggested that there's something undemocratic about the Constitution. And it seems to me that we have to ask then, how do we define democracy? Mm-hmm. If you define democracy as the will of the people with full respect for the rights of the individual, mm-hmm. and presumably that means ultimately the rights of minorities as well, mm-hmm. then couldn't you say that the American people as a sovereign entity have endorsed this Constitution, and the Constitution does not make permanent minorities whose rights will not be thoroughly accepted? If we had status minorities in the United States, African Americans, women, whatever, that would be something else. What we've got is transient minorities, people who disagree with the majority about a particular issue, and yet the majority of the people seem to be comfortable with the idea that minorities may be overridden. Transient minorities may be overridden and the majority can rule. Is there something undemocratic about that? Even if what part of the democratic process for most of the people, which is fine, is something like the Senate, which indeed has all of the flaws that you pointed out, but isn't necessarily undemocratic?
It's going to depend. It's going to depend on how you define democracy, and on, by custom, most of us grow up thinking the United States is the exemplar of democracy. How could anything be wrong here? So that's what's interesting about Dahl's book, because he's a student not of just this democracy but foreign, and he ends up saying he really likes the proportional representation, and there's very few federal systems that exist. But you make a good point. It's kind of like you have the way we have it structured is there's not distinct minorities that are excluded. I mean, they were, but we've gotten over that. My point about inclusion, right? So I'm trying to point out that there's still some inequality deep within the structure that we probably won't deal with because it's just too hard to deal with it. But it's there, and it has policy consequences. Do they bother the public at large? Probably not so much. But it has to do with the frustration about getting things done when it comes back to, it's a question of degree, right? You get a parliamentarian moment with Obama's election, and kind of like 64 or 32, how much can get done? Well, quite a lot got done. But still, the sausage process was frustrating to people. So I think it just depends on your view on democracy. So I think you raise a good point.
Mickey Edwards and I were at a gathering of former members recently, and one of the members pointed out of Obama, who was a president of the other party, but why should he not be able to get more of his agenda accomplished when 53% of the American people voted for him? Why should 41 members of the Senate be able to block that? And to me, I think the Congress has had a pretty remarkable record of achievement. I think the problem has been in really maybe informing the public as to what has been done, or maybe the people have a good idea what's being done and they don't like it. I wonder if Congress has dropped the ball in informing the people better about what it's doing, whether the president has or what's going on there. But there does seem to be a disconnect of some sort. Anybody want to tackle that one?
Well, I mean, what's different from old days, and most of the people in my party did not support a lot of the things in the agenda that the president had, and I think there's clearly a lot of American voters who are very unhappy about what was passed by Congress. But one of the things that's changed, and it goes back a little bit to what Kevin was bringing up, is there is much more transparency in some ways today than there used to be. So you get a very complex health care bill, or you get some other piece of legislation that is large, the stimulus package or whatever, And you got a lot of people out there who are dissecting it on the internet, and maybe some of the information is false, some of it true. But there was a time when you just you vote. I'm not saying it was good, but there was a time when big bills came up, and you dealt with them in the House, and you passed them, and then you kind of went back and you explained to your constituents a little bit of what you did, but they didn't really know the details, and they were not nearly as informed about all these things. So the conflict that is going to come from those people who don't like what the Congress did is going to be much worse now, because you can't just go back and say, don't worry, it's okay, we did good. You can't do that now.
Yeah.
Now they're saying on page 617 of the health bill, you're killing grandma, right?
Right.
Right.
On your point, I think a lot of it is just the economy. I mean, you don't call it the Great. It's a Great Recession for a reason, right? I mean, they labeled it the Great Depression because of the depth and the duration. It's the Great Recession because it is, and nobody out there thinks of it as the recession's over, even though technically the economists have been telling us for quite a while. Because there's so many states that are, Washington's in a bubble for many reasons, but I also noticed about 6 months ago when I was visiting here that the unemployment rate all of a sudden came up to, it was almost 8%. I may be off by a fraction or something, but it was, and in many states it's much, much higher and has been for a long time. So I think it's the economy. So even though if the economy was much better, the Democrats would be getting a lot more recognition for what they achieved. Mm-hmm. But they didn't do enough from the voters' point of view. What did you do for me lately on the economy?
Greg?
Kevin's absolutely right. I mean, what's behind the Democrats' slide in the polls is the economy, among other things. But still, I would expect that in their campaign ads, they'd be running on their three main successes: a stimulus bill, a health care bill, and financial reform. And at least what I read is that they're running away from many of these things. And so that's a puzzle. Part of it seems to be the way that they passed some of these bills, right? That especially in the House, the massive bills that, for whatever reason, did not go through a slow, deliberate, regular order, and it says were sort of written in the back room and sort of passed through. The Rules Committee said, we're going to debate this tomorrow. And then they debated it for a few hours, maybe with an amendment, maybe not, one. And then that was it. And so the process by which they passed some major legislation, very quickly, without a lot of careful reading of the bills, and then explaining them to their constituents line by line, I think it contributes to why they are not campaigning on them now.
Hey, we had Stephen Shore and then Jeff Biggs.
Two thoughts. The first is, have we reached the stage where it may be a 2-year congressional term is unrealistically short, forcing people to constantly campaign, and the role of campaign contributions seems to have, which we've had since the start of the Republic, seems to have radically changed, and combined with a Supreme Court that seems to cannot, a majority of which cannot distinguish between outright bribery and freedom of speech.
Anybody want to tackle that one?
Can I touch on the permanent campaign question? Because along with polarization and partisanship and gridlock, et cetera, another constant complaint is that we're in a condition of having a sort of permanent campaign. That too is part of the Constitution. And Woodrow Wilson, by the way, made this point very, very clearly. In the British parliamentary system, one party is the government, the other party is the opposition. Their elections make a decision. This party is the government, that party is the opposition. Now, the recent coalition government that they sort of created, that's an exception to the rule over British history. But our constitutional system never does that. Neither party is ever the government, even under conditions of united party government. And neither party is ever simply the opposition. As long as there is a Senate, if Kevin doesn't get rid of it, as long as there is a Senate, the minority party will have leverage. In our political system, neither party is ever simply the government or simply the opposition. So there is a permanent campaign, in fact, built into our constitutional system. It isn't a new phenomenon.
Mickey?
Just two things. In terms of the 2-year term, I guess I'm going to come over closer to Kevin's point here. I like the 2-year term, and I like the 2-year term because it gives the people a chance to correct course. I worked very actively for Ronald Reagan and was an admirer of his, but when he was elected, a lot of the people who came in with him misread the mandate. So you have people like Jim Watt that thought that meant you should get rid of the Beach Boys. I mean, they had some crazy stuff. And the voters, yanked their chain. For those first 2 years, given the number of Republicans plus the number of very conservative Democrats who were then the boll weevils, Reagan had effective control. But then the voters 2 years later were able to change course and say, you misread us. So I like giving the voters that option to make changes more quickly. In terms of the cost of campaigns has skyrocketed enormously. My preference, because I don't want a system of federal funding where my tax dollars go to support a KKK member like David Duke. I don't want stuff like that. I personally think we should attack that problem from the other side. I did not like raising money. Most members of Congress don't like having to raise money. There are things in terms of free TV and radio time, letting candidates, that's because those are public airwaves, letting candidates put their platforms or parts of their platforms in the statewide mailings that states like California do on referendum issues, do things like that. There are ways to reduce the cost where people can get their messages out less expensively. I think that's a better way to do it.
Yeah, just one more point on that. Sure. Just not so much on the what Bill was talking about, but on the partisanship. But it's interesting, back to Mickey's point, even when the Democrats or the Republicans have control, because we do have a Congress and a president, you don't have that united front. And so in domestic legislation, often the president may have his party there, but the chairman and the leaders don't agree. So look, lots of instances of that. Now the president gets his way on foreign policy since World War II, but on domestic policy, it's the Congress throws its weight.
It's kind of interesting. Back in the 60s, there was a movement to change the Constitution to give members 4-year terms that would be coterminous with the president's term, and that way the Congress would supposedly be more responsive to the president. But then you had sort of the backlash against the imperial presidency. Even Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said, I was wrong in playing up the presidency in all my histories too much, and we're paying the price for it. So you don't hear a lot of talk of making Congress that responsive or in sync with the president and the presidential elections. Jeff Biggs? Wait for the microphone, please.
My compliments to Don Wolfensberger for once again assembling a very interesting panel. There's been a lot of emphasis in the comments here on the will of the people, civic engagement, bringing the citizens closer to government. In this country, we put very few burdens on the average citizen. You got to serve on a jury, you got to pay your taxes, and you're supposed to vote. In the recent primary in Montgomery County, which is one of those highly educated, biggest salaried on the doorstep of Washington, D.C., 11.6% of the eligible voters actually turned out at the polls. Now, and I was amazed by some of Mr. Edwards' examples of important decisions being made by relatively very few people. So, to be outrageous, what does the panel think of decisions like countries like Australia have made, which is to, in fact, require voting by the public?
Well, they're not the only ones. Costa Rica does it. A number of other countries do it. Let me back it one step. I had the pleasure, after I left Congress, of teaching for quite a while. I taught at Harvard and then at Princeton. Very few courses in either of those very fine institutions about the legislative branch or about the Constitution. In our public schools, if you want to learn to be an engineer, we do emphasize science and math, but we don't anymore emphasize civics, social studies. Those are gone. I'm on a panel that Randy Weingarten at the American Federation of Teachers put together to talk about how, and E.D. Hirsch is on that and some others, how do we deal with this problem? So I think the problem is not just that we, maybe need to force them to pay a fine to vote, but we need to get people to understand what's at stake here. We have democracy requires participation, but we don't teach that anymore. We don't teach it in the good universities, the mediocre universities, the high schools. We don't teach it anywhere, and I think we're paying a price in terms of the low turnout we get.
Yes,
I'll take that.
Greg?
Jeff, you'd be very disappointed in me. I didn't vote in the most recent Florida election. But that's because Florida has a closed primary system, and I am not registered with either political party, and so there is no meaningful question for me to vote on. So, yes, mandatory voting would be great, but especially if combined with some sort of open primary or jungle primary system. And that might also address the polarization of the political parties that we've also talked about. If candidates for office know that they are not just campaigning for the 10 to 11% of the population that's actually going to turn out to vote in a closed primary, but instead they can appeal to independent voters, or that they're competing against not just members of their own party to be the most conservative, the most liberal, but they're also just competing for one of the 2 slots on the November ballot. That changes their incentives a great deal. So, fine.
Tom, did you have a question? Tom Slider?
Yes. I'd like to second the several comments, Don, that have been made about this panel, especially as such a great panel for Constitution Day. So I think it's been a great discussion. There's no doubt in my mind that the system has some very serious problems, but I just observe it also doesn't prevent it from having an occasional sense of humor. Jeff mentioned the primary elections last Tuesday. Well, in the District of Columbia, the Democratic voters rejected the current incumbent Democratic mayor and selected his challenger to go to the ballot in November. The Republican voters, on the other hand, selected the current incumbent Democratic mayor as their choice for mayor next November. So every once in a while, I think the factions get a little bit mixed up when presented with a choice that's not quite of their liking. But my question is to the panel, probably the most energized group of people in the country today are those that have been espousing a return to constitutional fundamentals, the Tea Party. And I'm not sure exactly what they mean by that, but I think it gets at some of the issues that we've been talking about. For the panel, do you think this bodes well or ill for the future of our system?
I'd like to address that, if I may. We were talking earlier about perhaps we need more education on politics and on the Constitution in order to promote greater civic engagement. I'm all in favor of that. I think everybody should be required to study Madison and Tocqueville and et cetera. So I think that's
and read your book.
And to sign my book, sure. I think that's a great idea. But it isn't clear to me that participation these days is necessarily suffering. Partisan polarization has, in fact, contributed to greater voter turnout. And the polarization in our politics today has resulted in, again, the August town halls where people are pouring into these, and the Tea Party movement. I do think that Alan Ehrenhalt, who wrote a book many years ago called The United States of Ambition, is that right? Mm-hmm. Makes an important point. It's the same point that George Washington Plunkett, an old professional politician, made about what he called amateurs or reformers. That movement politics eventually becomes establishment politics. That every once in a while, a little ferment in our politics, the Tea Party movement may be the latest, Perot may have been an example of that, other examples in the 60s, for example, is a good thing. It re-energizes our politics, and certainly it shakes up the two political parties. So I think the participation, sure, I would love more citizens to be involved, and I do think that we should take seriously the idea that more education in our public schools would help promote that. But I think the greater participation that you're seeing today is actually a good thing.
Mickey?
I don't know whether I challenge that or don't challenge it. I think this is something for those of you who are scholars to look at. there's certainly been a lot of noise. There's been a lot of anger expressed. There have been a lot of people who show up when Glenn Beck has a big rally. But then when you look at what actually happened in the Delaware race, the woman who won got 30,000 votes. Mike Castle got 27,000 in a state of nearly 1 million people. 57,000 people voted. And we mentioned Utah, and you know, I don't know that the numbers show that there's increased participation. There's a lot of noise, and you know, in Delaware, it was just a case of who got their voters to the polls. Because one of the things you know in politics is that it doesn't matter whether the people are for you or against you. It only matters whether the ones who you actually get to the polls are for you or against you. So I don't know, Bill, that I've actually seen that there's been this big increase in participation as a result, and there may be. You may be right. I think that's worth somebody examining.
What I was referring to was the increase in turnout in general elections, which clearly has occurred, and it's partly because of the partisan polarization in recent cycles, especially presidential elections.
Let me make a closing remark here, and that is when I called to one of my friends' attention at the American Political Science Association convention, we were having this Constitution Day program and invited my friend to come. He said, yes, one of my colleagues in the profession has a view on that maybe you would want to pass on. I said, what's that? He said, well, all the schools now, by federal law, are supposed to be educating their children today about the Constitution. He says, and my friend says that's an unconstitutional mandate. Well, I just want you to know that the Wilson Center, even though it's funded 1/3 by the federal government and 2/3 private, and we by the way, we do have one of our funders here, Judy Blanchard of Chevron. We're grateful for their grant to the Congress Project. But I do want you to know that we are not acting under a mandate here, but under the belief that we can help further discussion on our constitutional system. But thank you all for coming, and please join us for the reception.